Hey,
I'm
Sherry.
so glad that you all go. Oh,
Oh,
go ahead. Was that Allison? I think my sound went out.
No, I muted. It
Oh,
was Allison. She just
okay.
re-muted herself. Oh my God.
Okay. I was just telling Sherry, I'm like imagining the worst things possible happening. So, okay. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I made a little, I'm really extra. So I made a presentation on PowerPoint because that's what I do. So, all right. Um, I am not sure. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Awesome. Yay, when things work. Okay. Now let's see if it'll let me do this. Yeah. Okay. Move this over. All right. So I chose to title this Cannabis from Ancient Medicine to Devil's Lettuce and Back Again because poor little cannabis has had quite a journey. It started off as this special medicine and has gotten just the worst rep, and now we're on our way back. So I have my notes. So if you wonder why I'm looking down, that's why. So, but hopefully you're looking at my screen. All right, so here we go. Let's see if it works. All right, so I wanted to start with some common debunked cannabis myths. So these are things that a lot of people think are true about cannabis, but they have been proven false. So cannabis's harms have been proven scientifically. Cannabis has no medicinal value. Cannabis is a gateway drug. Cannabis offenses are not severely punished. Cannabis policy in the Netherlands is a failure. Cannabis kills brain cells. Cannabis causes an amotivational syndrome, basically makes you do nothing. Cannabis impairs memory and cognition. Cannabis can cause permanent mental illness. Cannabis causes crime. Cannabis interferes with male and female sex hormones. Cannabis use during pregnancy damages the fetus. Cannabis use impairs the immune system. Cannabis is more damaging to the lungs than tobacco. Cannabis's active ingredient, THC, gets trapped in body fat. Cannabis use is a major cause of highway accidents. Cannabis-related hospital emergencies are increasing, particularly among youth, and cannabis use must be prevented. Fake news. All fake news. Cannabis has been a medicine since at least 2800 BCE, as it's mentioned in the medical compendium Pen Sao of the legendary Chinese emperor Shen Nung, known as the father of Chinese medicine. He determined that the female plant, being a very high source of yin, contained the most potent medicine and prescribed chu ma, which is female hemp, as opposed to ma, which is male hemp, for the treatment of absent-mindedness, constipation, malaria, beriberi, rheumatism, and menstrual problems. He was so thoroughly impressed with the benefits that he deemed it one of the superior elixirs of immortality. Remains of a ritual object that contained charred hemp seeds dating back at least 5,000 years have been excavated in Romania. The Yanghai tombs near Turpan, China, were excavated to reveal the 2,700-year-old grave of a Caucasoid shaman whose accoutrements included a large cache of cannabis, superbly preserved by climatic and burial conditions. The cannabis, female plants only, was presumably employed by this culture as a medicinal or psychoactive agent, or an aid to divination. The earliest known hemp-based textiles, woven fabrics dating back to 7,000 BCE, were discovered in northern China. In India, evidence for cannabis use dates to between 1400 and 2000 BCE. And in Egypt, remnants of a cannabis plant were found on the mummified Ramses II, circa 1200 BCE. In the millennium before Christ, hemp was our planet's largest agricultural crop, a major industry providing fabric for clothing, sails, rope, paper, canvases, medicine, lamp oil, and food. And until the 1940s, it was listed in America's pharmacopoeia. 1893 India. Cannabis is ground into fine pieces, sorting out seeds and stems. Combined with water and spices, working it into a paste and rolled into balls called bang. The bang is rubbed with fruit, yogurt, and spices over a sieve, and water is filtered through the mix, which creates a drink. This is made in the honor of Shiva. It might be Shiva, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Some followers dedicate their lives to Shiva and are called sadhus. They will also smoke cannabis in pipes called chillums. They renounce all earthly possessions and are respected and revered by the public there. That year, the Indian Hemp Drug Commission meets about the hemp issue. Sadhus line the streets, their smoking creating noxious odors. Some of the incorrect rumors are spreading about it causing insanity, and they've made it that those rumors have made it to the commission as well. So instead of causing aggression by the public for moving against the sadhus, they do a study thinking if it proves the cannabis is driving sadhus mad, that the public will not disagree with scientific facts. 1,100 people are questioned in a survey. They asked many questions like, does it make you lazy? Does it deaden the intellect, etc.? Doctors who were questioned said it had no negative effects, physical, mental, or moral. It does not cause insanity, even in heavy users, or even bronchitis. They forced a monkey to smoke cannabis daily for over 8 months, then killed and dissected it only to find no adverse effects of any kind. They visited 24 insane asylums only to find no causal effect between cannabis and insanity. Because their methods were sound during the study, the final report proved no ill effects, and they were forced to accept its findings and suggest no arrests for cultivation or sale, and most importantly, had the ethical grounds to tax it since it would not harm anyone. This is the way it should have gone in the U.S. Cannabis in the U.S. must first start with Mexico. In 1518, Cortez invaded Mexico to claim it for Spain and brought with him hemp seeds, of course, as it was a major cash crop of the time. Over the next few centuries, cultivators bred the hemp to have larger flowers or buds and less fibrous stems for consumption. They had already discovered psilocybin mushrooms and peyote, so it was inevitable that they would find this use for it and breed for it specifically. The first written account in Mexico is 1760 in a Catholic church where someone complained about an herb that allowed people access to the spirit world. Despite the church's disdain of something that's obviously from Satan, its use spread throughout Mexico, and by the 1850s, they were the ones who cataloged it as cannabis sativa. At this time, patent medicines described as cure-alls became popular in the U.S., and I know you've all heard of them, those snake elixirs, like, oh, this will solve everything, like cocaine-filled chewables. So cannabis became an active ingredient in many of those, like Stello's asthma cure. The culture of using it recreationally, though, had not been imported to the U.S. just yet. Not until the Mexican Revolution, when people started fleeing north with cannabis culture in tow. So at this time in the 1800s, the U.S. was a time of great experimentation in all branches of medicine. Colleges and schools focusing on herbs and other aspects of medicine were popping up all across the United States. The Flexner Report brought all that to an end. It was a book-length study written by the professional educator Abraham Flexner, and it was published in 1910 under the aegis of the Carnegie Foundation. The report was partially conceived by Charles Eliot and Simon Flexner, both of the Rockefeller Foundation and Institute, and Simon suggested his brother as the author. One of the recommendations of the report was that those who gave money to medical schools supporting them stop sponsoring the herbal ones because they did not have the proper, quote, laboratories and texts, and many other reasons. 3 years after the Flexner Report is published, Abraham goes on to work for the Rockefeller Institute, implementing the recommendations in his report over the next 2 decades. This influential report contributed greatly to the decline of alternative medicine, including herbology. And even more interesting, 10 years before, Rockefeller began putting money into eugenics, which is a science based on genetics created to justify racism. 1914, El Paso, Texas. A fight breaks out between white Texans and Mexican immigrants. Cops found cannabis on the Mexicans and associated their violent behavior with the cannabis they found. Racist and false rumors start to spread. A Texas state senator claimed on record, all Mexicans are crazy and this stuff makes them that way. An ordinance was passed in El Paso, the first against cannabis. Designed allegedly to control cannabis, the law succeeded only in providing a weapon the local government could beat Mexicans with. Under this new law, police had a reason to harass Mexican immigrants. If they found cannabis on them, they'd be jailed or deported. Quite a nice tool to use, huh? 1915, William Randolph Hearst. He's a newspaper tycoon, and I'm sure some of you have heard of him as he owns pretty much all the magazines in the world now. He has a 1 million-acre ranch in Mexico at the time. It's called Babacora, and that's taken over by Pancho Villa's men. He then drops the word cannabis and hemp from his newspapers completely and replaces it with the word marijuana. This gives it this bad racist tone and gives him a very sore spot when it comes to Mexicans, and you'll want to remember that as the presentation goes on. So 1920, jazz music is hitting New Orleans, and so is cannabis. Black workers and Mexican workers work very closely together in Texas, and so they brought it with them to New Orleans. Vice districts are some of the places use took hold, mainly in the speakeasies, and especially among Black musicians creating this new music called jazz. Cannabis use becomes part of jazz culture, and where jazz goes, so does cannabis. Dr. Oscar Dowie, president of the Louisiana Board of Health, here's a story at this time about a musician from a nice white family, so, quote, hooked on the stuff that he forges a doctor's signature, a felony. Oh, who would hear of a white person doing a felony? He has the ear of Governor Parker, and he tells him this story and how it's a powerful narcotic that used to just be used by Mexicans and Blacks, but this guy was white. Governor Parker writes to Prohibition Commissioner John F. Kramer about the dangers of marijuana and how it's taking over in New Orleans, that it should be illegal as it makes men crazy and wild. Kramer responds he's too busy with alcohol prohibition to even bother with this cannabis stuff he's never heard of. Anti-cannabis sentiment spreads through New Orleans' medical and legal communities. Quote, it's a sexual stimulant that makes crimes like rape increase. It's a psychological stimulant, so they get all jacked up and need a thrill, and next they're robbing and assaulting people. By the time the Great Depression hits in 1929, cannabis use has popped up in many cities where Mexican immigrants had found work and settled. They made up most of the agricultural labor force. At this point, white Americans want jobs that were previously undesirable to them. Mexicans came here with their marijuana and took our jobs. They smoke reefer and do crimes. Americans don't do that. 1930, in comes Harry Anslinger. He's chosen to be the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics by his wife's uncle, Andrew Mellon. That's why they don't allow that stuff anymore, guys. He will become cannabis's greatest enemy. Originally, cannabis was not in Anslinger's sights at all. The goal was to deal with heroin, and he had support of drug companies who, under these new laws, would be the only ones who could make heroin for, quote, those who really need it, like war veterans and cripples. Primarily, the concern is too many people are making it untaxed and unregulated. Now, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is empowered by the U.S. Treasury, so their main goal is financial, and that's super important to remember. They always just want to make money for the U.S. New Orleans police officers and other officials start to deluge Anslinger as soon as he's put in the post, with calls about marijuana being tied to crime sexual in nature, causing citizens to lose their civilized inhibitions. He sends out a survey about this Indian hemp, asking what are the medicinal uses, value, etc., and any info people were willing to share. Of the 30 respondents, there was only one cautionary tale of a soldier who used it during World War I to calm his nerves, but when he returned home, he considered himself an addict. He checked himself into a sanatorium and was given treatment for morphine addiction since they didn't have cannabis treatment at the time. This included electrotherapy and other harmful techniques. It took him months to return to normal. Cannabis use was likely therapeutic in the field and in dealing with his PTSD. He diagnosed himself and was mistreated in the sanatorium. Anslinger will be focusing on this one story, eventually using it as ammo against cannabis, but Anslinger at this time is still not convinced. Dr. Fossier, a New Orleans doctor, a very respected one, reads his paper, Marijuana Menace, to the Louisiana Medical Society. Falsehoods that he states in this paper include: marijuana has a history mired in cruel and fanatical murder. The Hashishans, who terrorized Asia and parts of Europe, would consume weed before killing their victims. This is a myth that grew from the similarity of the names. 1 of every people arrested in New Orleans is on weed. Most murderers smoke marijuana. Marijuana causes a moral failing. When compared to alcohol, it's the greater of evils because whites are the dominant race and those countries that consume it have deteriorated. These theories are well received and often cited in future scholarship. Misinformation spreads quickly. By this time, Anslinger wants to create a uniform drug policy to regulate and tax narcotics, and he wanted this bill, most importantly, to create revenue. Remember, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is backed by the U.S. Treasury. The states would not agree to this Uniform Drug Act. His career was on the line. He'd have to rewrite it and sell it by hijacking public opinion. Alcohol prohibition had ended by this time, so he had to keep his reputation intact. He had no choice but to target the one thing that people were talking about at the time, cannabis. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics rewrites the Uniform Drug Act. Let me see. Oop. Sorry, guys. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics rewrites the Uniform Drug Act. This new version has 14 pages dedicated to cannabis, and I realize I just skipped ahead. So let me go back one. Boop. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. So the Federal Bureau of Narcotics rewrites the Uniform Drug Act. This new version has 14 pages dedicated to cannabis, where the previous version had just 1 page. Anslinger takes this new bill on tour, aided by his friends in high places. During a speech to the House Appropriations Committee, he revealed a new focus on cannabis, how it used to be confined to Mexicans and blacks, but poor white college students find themselves at a party where there are some colored students, and these colored students use marijuana, especially on white girls, while telling them their sob stories about race for sympathy. And the next thing you know, they turn up pregnant. He travels the nation speaking anywhere that will let him, spreading these awful stories. Anslinger's own racist feelings and ideas also played a role in the attacks on cannabis. He would commonly use the words boy or the N-word while referring to his black coworkers. When they complained, he would have them fired. There was a little pushback. Senator Guffey from Pennsylvania pushed for him to be fired for using the N-word in a government memo, but it went nowhere. He had it out for jazz musicians in particular, as it was this scary music popularized by blacks whom he saw as inferior. Louis Armstrong was caught with a joint outside a club. He was allowed to finish his show, and then he was taken to jail for 9 days. Anslinger was obsessed with Billie Holiday, planting drugs on her, harassing her, dragging her through legal battles, and stripping her of her cabaret license, eventually arresting her for narcotics possession while she died of cirrhosis of the liver. Fictitious headlines and wild stories began to pop up in newspapers thanks to Hearst and his racism, like Mexican family goes insane in the New York Times on July 6, 1927. The story states that a Mexican widow, broke and starving, finds some marijuana growing in her garden, and out of ideas, she feeds it to her children. The neighbor notices violent laughter coming from next door, and by the time the police arrive, the entire family is in hysterics, having gone insane beyond recovery. This is a win-win for Hearst and Anslinger. Hearst sells more papers, and Anslinger gains momentum on his fight against cannabis and the support that he needed for his new drug laws. These crazy stories in newspapers became known as the Gore Files. The most notable one is the Victor Licata, the one in the middle there. He killed his entire family thanks to early dementia and psychotic episodes. Like, this man was really, literally sick. But Anslinger chose to change one minor detail. He was in a state of delirium induced by marijuana use. This was a normal man, but he was changed into a killer after smoking marijuana. The medical community did push back a little against these false claims. Dr. Walter Bromberg did a study that, while flawed, did contradict Anslinger's. This study gained a lot of notoriety, so Anslinger finds his own scholar who would play ball. Dr. Munch, professor of pharmacology at Princeton. This man believed things like the entire plant, including seeds and stems, is psychoactive, and that if birds ate only hemp seeds, they would cease to sing. In the weeks leading up to the Marijuana Tax Act hearings, Anslinger ramps up his rhetoric and enlisted help anywhere he could. The women's group movement was in full effect, and he made sure all of the influential ladies had the relevant talking points. In 1937, by now, no herbalism schools exist. If you remember back to the Flexner Report, all of the herbalism schools have just dropped away. So no schools of any kind are left to provide a champion to speak on behalf of cannabis when this act is being debated. The supposedly left-wing President Roosevelt was no help because FDR, who signed the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act into law, had been on Rockefeller's payroll since his first days in politics. Rockefeller, America's first billionaire and owner of Standard Oil, the largest oil company in the U.S., had successfully eliminated or bought out any potential opponent to the oil industry's attempts at outlawing their natural competitor, hemp. His attack on herbalism schools with the Flexner Report of 1910 made Andrew Mellon's attacks in the 20s and 30s possible. Andrew Mellon owned Alcoa, Gulf Oil, and the Mellon Bank. In the 20s, Mellon financed DuPont's takeover of General Motors, and DuPont owned chemicals used by Hearst's paper-making factories. Are you guys seeing how these are all tying together? Hearst, along with Congressman Robert Doughton and Senator Prentice Brown, who were both DuPont allies, combined their strength and passed the Marijuana Tax Act with little opposition. The DuPont 1937 annual report stated, "The revenue-raising power of government may be converted into an instrument for forcing acceptance of sudden new ideas of industrial and social reorganization." And I'm going to read that one more time because there's a lot of big words in there, and I just want to read it so you soak it in, listening to every word. "The revenue-raising power of government may be converted into an instrument for forcing acceptance of sudden new ideas of industrial and social reorganization." The revenue-raising they're talking about is a tax act designed to avoid handing out any tax stamps, a prohibition pretending to be a tax. With hemp rope gone, DuPont's new invention, nylon, would be one of the synthetic, quote, sudden new ideas accepted by North American citizens. The hemp-free paper, made in Hearst factories from trees using DuPont's chemicals would be another. The same went for fuel. The cost of hemp fuel would dramatically differ from ethanol fuel. According to one researcher, with today's enzyme technology, hemp ethanol could be produced for $1.37 per gallon, plus the cost of raw material, with technological improvements and tax credits reducing the price by another dollar or so per gallon. The cost of raw material would then decrease as hemp was grown for more products, providing almost free hemp stalks as a waste product. Rockefeller and Mellon could envision this and preferred their vision of dirty fuel monopolies for Standard Oil and Gulf Oil rather than clean fuel farms for prosperous farmers. It was crucial to their business model that hemp became illegal and stayed illegal. April 27, 1937, the congressional hearings on the Marijuana Tax Act. Anslinger and Munch talk about how it corrupts public health and morals and proposes a tax so exorbitant that it would be prohibitively expensive. They trotted out all their best arguments, including quoting major newspapers published by his buddy Hearst. Despite the misinformation, congressmen were mostly unaware of cannabis and why they should even care about it. He shares his Gore files, and those stories are the camel that, or whatever. That's enough. The bill is sent to the House and is passed in October 1937. Anslinger made sure the moment, that's why you don't improv during presentations. Okay. Anslinger made sure the moment the law passed that there were agents in place to start busting people. So before they even knew that the law existed, they were being arrested. They made as many busts as they could right away to prove the law necessary. Anti-prohibitionist mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, was skeptical. He commissioned his own scientific study. It revealed that cannabis had no effect on the morality of subjects, the only exception being that while under the influence, the subject was more likely to tolerate use by others. So basically, while they're smoking weed, they don't care if somebody else is smoking weed. Makes sense. It also had no effect on legislation. Under this new legislation, 3,000 to 4,000 cannabis sellers and users would be arrested. Sentencing was largely dependent on the judge's discretion, the average being 18 months in jail. It's during this time that Anslinger comes up with the most repeated and debunked cannabis myth of all time, the gateway drug theory, where it basically, when you smoke weed, it'll make you go and move on to other drugs, which is absolutely not true. So 1948, the UN begins updating its international drug policy. Anslinger's bad idea was about to spread across the world. He's interviewed by the UN in conjunction with the release of his new book, Traffic in Narcotics. He declares his previous actions a success by claiming overdoses were down, while at the same time saying marijuana use remained very dangerous, especially to the youth. The UN spent years developing a single drug policy. Most countries were fine with banning cannabis, despite a few arguments like India. They said it wasn't right to limit a country of its natural resources, and even tried to get special language where bang is exempt. Instead, they were given 25 years to make changes, but had to sign as the rest of the world was signing. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs for the UN is signed in 1961 and required all of the signatories to have strict regulations on cannabis and other drugs and created the first drug scheduling system. In 1952, at Anslinger's urging, Representative Bogg of Louisiana sponsored a bill that would punish users further by creating minimum sentences. Dr. Harris Isbell of the U.S. Addiction Research Center testified against the act, saying it doesn't lead to death nor violence of any kind, that tobacco use is actually much worse for you. Nevertheless, the bill passed, and President Truman signed it into law. All drugs would now be treated equally, cannabis the same as heroin. It created mandatory minimum sentences of 2 to 5 years in prison for drug offenses. In come the 1960s. Despite the new laws, cannabis use would increase. Timothy Leary, psychologist, writer, and advocate for the potential therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs, was arrested when cannabis was found in his car. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The law at the time required someone, if they wished to possess marijuana, to announce that intent to the government, which would immediately make them a member of a group inherently suspected of criminal activity, violating the Fifth Amendment. A person cannot be forced to incriminate themselves. Leary won the case. Congress repealed the Marijuana Tax Act and immediately replaced it with a harsher set of laws, changing the way federal government would respond to cannabis. I'm going to take a little sip real quick. So in 1970, Nixon commissions a report on cannabis to help inform the Controlled Substances Act. Former governor of Pennsylvania, Raymond Schaefer, was appointed to lead the commission. Nixon told him that no matter what the findings were, that he was not for legalization. Schaefer's commission did an incredibly thorough job surveying the many ways in which cannabis intersects with society. They offered extremely sensible suggestions on policy, saying that cannabis is not physically addictive, it's not a gateway drug, it's not harmful to anyone, and should be descheduled and declassified. Nixon trashed the report. Instead, he had Senator James Segregation Not Discrimination Eastland hold hearings which would present a different view using their own, quote, experts that completely disregarded the Schaefer report and gave hours of provably false testimony by people out to demonize cannabis. That same year, Nixon signs the Controlled Substances Act. The new bill provides 300 new DEA agents. It implements the plan set up by the UN's Single Convention on Narcotics. It places cannabis in the Schedule 1 section, labeling it as one of the most dangerous substances in the world, with absolutely no therapeutic value. A Nixon aide later admitted Nixon wanted the law focused on blacks and hippies, whom he considered his greatest enemies. In 1976, Bob Randall, glaucoma sufferer, was arrested for cannabis possession, but was acquitted due to a medical necessity defense. In 1978, he brought a civil suit against the government for access to his medicine for the rest of his life. They considered it an investigational new drug, IND, and created a pretense that they would study this new drug with one research subject, Randall. The Compassionate Use IND program, at its height in 1991, supplied 13 patients. But when Randall explained to AIDS advocacy groups how to apply for compassionate use and 40 applications flooded the program, it was shut down in 1992. When Lewis Sullivan was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, he made a statement that because of the AIDS patients, we can't have this program. There will be rampant sex if they get hold of this cannabis. That really upsets me. My uncle was alive during this time and suffering from AIDS and probably could have gotten a lot of relief from that. Those 13 patients were grandfathered in, and as the years went by, the patients died, fewer remained in the program. Today, there are 4 still alive. The ironic part is that even though our government is dispensing medication to those 4 people, it still refuses to think of cannabis as a medication with any accepted medical use. Meanwhile, at the same time, India is running out of time on the ratification deadline for the UN's Single Treaty on Narcotics. They had to outlaw cannabis to remain in the UN. So September 1985, India passes the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. They worded it to allow the bhang preparation made in religious ceremonies. Indian sadhus continue to smoke cannabis regularly in public in defiance of the law. They are so respected, though, that the practice is accepted by the general public. At this time, AIDS is an epidemic, and patients get massive relief from cannabis for nausea, pain, fear, appetite, and more. Buyers clubs pop up, and people like Dennis Perrin, whose lover Jonathan needed it to treat his symptoms, and he used it himself to treat his alcoholism, are arrested for opening these clubs. At San Francisco General Hospital, a volunteer named Mary Jane Rathman is arrested for serving cannabis brownies to the patients, becoming known as Brownie Mary. She was arrested 3 times for it, each time gaining greater attention for medical cannabis. The effort to make cannabis available as a prescription drug was initiated in 1972 by NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. In 1986, John Lawn, the administrator for the DEA, finally announced that he would hold the public hearings ordered by the court 7 years before. Those hearings lasted 2 years and involved many witnesses, both patients and doctors, and thousands of pages of documentation. The DEA's own administrative law judge, Francis L. Young, reviewed all the evidence, and he rendered his decision in 1988. He concluded that it met the currently accepted medical use in treatment in the U.S. established by the Controlled Substances Act, and he added that cannabis in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. One must reasonably conclude that there is accepted safety for use of marijuana under medical supervision. To conclude otherwise on the record would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious. He went on to recommend that it be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. The DEA disregarded the opinion of its own administrative law judge, and they refused to reschedule marijuana. A group called Patients Out of Time was started in 1990 by Mary Lynn Mathra, a nurse, and Lieutenant Commander Al Byrne, both NORML board directors. Mary Lynn got together the first 5 compassionate IND patients for a conference and debate that was carried by C-SPAN, which ran the whole thing live, and then, after it ended, ran it over and over again. In 1995, Patients Out of Time incorporated in Virginia as a 501c3 nonprofit, and they now operate as an educational charity. They made an 18-minute video called Marijuana as Medicine with those 5 IND patients. It won awards all over the world and became a sort of icon. They began to show the video to healthcare professionals, starting with the Virginia Nurses Association, which had unanimous positive results. A resolution was drafted and presented to the American Medical Association at the Open Forum meeting in San Diego in 1995, and the assembled delegates voted to support the use of medical cannabis. Mary Lynn then went on to convince the American Nurses Association and the American College of Physicians. A coalition of members led by Dr. John Getman submitted the petition to reschedule cannabis in October 2002 to the DEA. They submitted references that accompanied 50,000 pages of documentation from around the world. The DEA had 3 years to make that decision. They took 3 years to the day, and their decision was to pass it to DHHS. The time period for their decision, for DHHS's decision, passed in the summer of 2008. When they were told by Patients Out of Time's lawyers that they had not met the requirements for the law, DHHS responded saying that the response to the petition has to be signed by the Surgeon General, and we don't have one right now. When we get one, we'll get back to you. In March 2010, they sent their recommendations back to the DEA, and that decision was denied by the DEA in 2011. The amount of time the DEA takes is insane when the FDA makes their decisions in 30 days. The 2006 and 2008 conferences put on by Patients Out of Time are now available through the UCSF School of Medicine's Continuing Medical Education website, where doctors and nurses from anywhere in the U.S. can view them online, take an exam, pay a fee, and receive online accreditation for clinical cannabis therapeutics. All these conferences, including the 2010 Rhode Island Conference, can be accessed at medicalcannabis.com. The National Institute on Drug Addiction, NIDA, the scientific body meant to study cannabis and other substances, has put up roadblocks every step of the way, making it nearly impossible for scientists and physicians to examine the therapeutic worth of smoked cannabis. Simply put, NIDA will fund only studies looking at risks, not benefits. Ironically, NIDA, which funds most of the world's drug studies, is also the institution putting up the most roadblocks in pursuit of this data. Endorsements and pleas from the National Academy of Medicine, the Institute of Medicine, and even the American Medical Association to reconsider marijuana as a medicine haven't yet swayed them. Since 1968, NIDA has been growing a supply of cannabis for research purposes under contract with the University of Mississippi's Pharmacy School. They have a monopoly on the supply that can be used for FDA-approved research. This is the key factor obstructing the development of cannabis into a legal medicine. The FDA is definitely not the problem. They have acted courageously when it comes to medical marijuana research. 1992, Rick Doblin, who's the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, just a mouthful for MAPS, we'll call it MAPS, sends a message to the director of research of the AIDS program at San Francisco General Hospital after Mary Rathbun, aka Brownie Mary, was arrested, suggesting that a clinical trial should come from that institution. The letter made its way to Donald Abrams, MD, professor of medicine at University of California, San Francisco, since he did community-based trials. He communicated with Rick about creating the clinical trials for comparing 3 different dosages of smoked cannabis versus Marinol. The FDA was very supportive of the study and approved it. Next step was to get a Schedule I license from the DEA. To do that, he had to get cannabis from NIDA because they're the only legal source in the country. However, NIDA denied it because they were doing studies on the effectiveness of cannabis and not the danger of it. When protease inhibitors arrived, HIV wasting disappeared, which was their main reason for study, so they had to find a new approach. A patient who had also taken ecstasy had died on the new AIDS protease inhibitors because of an interaction by way of the liver enzyme that metabolizes these drugs. It was the same mechanism involved in the metabolism of cannabinoids, so they were invited to submit to the National Institutes of Health by NIDA, who had funds available to study drug use in HIV patients. So they'll study it if it's about drug use in HIV patients, but not about the good things. The NIH created a special study section. They were granted funding, and they got NIDA marijuana, and they were able to do their first study. This study showed that cannabis was safe in this relatively vulnerable patient population, and there was no interaction between cannabis and the protease inhibitors, and that the patients actually gained weight. After having 2 studies approved by the FDA but blocked by NIDA's refusal to supply the marijuana, Rick realized that ending the NIDA monopoly on the supply of marijuana was the key to opening the door to privately funded marijuana development. He found Dr. Lyle Craker, director of the Medicinal Plant Program at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Dr. Craker applied to the DEA in 2001 for a license to establish a MAPS-sponsored production facility. The DEA did its best to delay the process by losing the application for 6 months and then refusing to respond for over 3 years until they sued the DEA for unreasonable delay under the Administrative Procedures Act. So they were finally allowed to have their hearings. Once they had their hearings, the guy who runs the marijuana project there at the University of Mississippi, Dr. Mahmoud El-Soli, goes on the record and states that these studies, the Missoula studies of 2001, were falsified. So what happened in 2001? Basically, the Missoula studies examined the health of the federal IND patients. They took 5 federal IND patients and all met in one room. They took pictures of the seeds and stems that came out of the marijuana cigarettes that they were issued. They unrolled them in front of multiple witnesses, in front of the advising doctor and 15 witnesses, and they published those pictures in the study. So when El Soli was under oath, he was asked how those seeds and stems could possibly be there, and he said, they're not. They've doctored the photographs. There is no way those seeds and stems were ever put in a cigarette that I issued. He lied under oath, and he was never charged with perjury. This is the reason that they were trying to get another grower. It had seeds and stems in it. This is not quality cannabis. So he's saying that's like the main reason. The government lawyers never followed up on him committing perjury, by the way. And it's also worth it to mention that El Soli has a conflict of interest as he makes money growing cannabis for Marinol privately. So it's in his best interest for the government cannabis to be low quality. It's in the government's interest also if they're doing cannabis research on lousy cannabis, then it's harder to show its effectiveness. The age is also incredible. Back in 2007, the canisters of joints that were being given to patients were often marked 1988 to 1992, which is pretty bad. So they eventually forced the DEA into an administrative law judge hearing that they actually won in February of 2007, when the administrative law judge, Mary Ellen Bittner, found that it would be in the public interest to end the NIDA monopoly and recommended that the DEA should license Professor Craker. True to form, the DEA delayed responding to the recommendation for 2 years, finally rejecting it 6 days before Obama was inaugurated. The DEA made some sloppy errors in their rejection, so they filed a motion to reconsider that halted the DEA's final ruling from going into effect. That was also denied. To this day, the University of Mississippi is still the only federally approved production facility for government-issued cannabis. Ads against cannabis use are sponsored by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, with donors in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the old anti-hemp team, Chevron and ExxonMobil, who were both previously Standard Oil, Hearst, and DuPont, who donate $30,000 to $100,000 yearly. Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan and Citibank sometimes provide up to $15,000 per year to the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, while General Motors and even Ford, who was once a proponent of hemp, give double that. Election campaign contributions also ensure that hemp remains prohibited or overregulated. The oil and gas industry donated $4,529,926 to the Bush presidential campaigns. From 1992 to 2002, energy giant Enron contributed a total of $3,021,108 to the Republican National Committee and other political campaigns, including Bush Quayle 92 and George W. Bush 2000. George Sr. was also a previous Texas oil man, and Dick Cheney ran Halliburton, the massive oil well construction and services corporation. Even former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice worked at Rockefeller's Chevron. They even named a tanker after her. So let's take a visit to Crazy Town, aka current day United States. The government holds the patent number 6630507 for medicinal use of cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. To further add to the irony, in 1999, the DEA and FDA moved THC pills, Marinol and others, from Schedule 2 to Schedule 3, a category for drugs with legitimate medical indications but some potential for abuse, like Vicodin and ketamine. The problem with these synthetic oral THC pills is they get you higher than smoked cannabis, and they last longer. To have the whole plant listed in Schedule 1 and its main psychoactive component listed in Schedule 3 is nonsensical, especially when you consider that THC is the chemical element in cannabis most thought to cause euphoria and the sense of an altered state. Sativex, a whole plant extract that is administered sublingually, is being approved in other countries as a prescription drug, but not in the U.S. Our government says it needs proof that cannabis is in fact therapeutic, but makes it impossible to prove with its monopoly on plant material from the approved farm in Mississippi. FDA requires NIDA to sign off on cannabis studies, a hoop that no other drug researchers need jump through. Cigarettes and alcohol remain unscheduled, while a full 20% of deaths in America are caused by them. Cannabis kills no one. It is impossible to overdose, but there is tremendous lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry, alcohol distilleries, the textile industries, and petroleum interests to keep the status quo in the prohibition of cannabis and hemp. Today, transferring to Schedule 2 would not be enough to make it available as a prescription drug. Such drugs must undergo rigorous, expensive, and time-consuming tests before they're approved by the FDA. This system is designed to regulate the commercial distribution of products made by drug companies and protect the public about false or misleading claims about their efficacy or safety, not for plant matter. It just doesn't make sense. The cost of this process exceeds $200 million per drug. There are doubts that it's possible to develop cannabis as an officially recognized medicine via this route. The plant cannabis also cannot be patented. You just can't patent a plant that grows naturally. If the full potential of cannabis as a medicine were to be achieved in the setting of the present prohibition system, many problems would have to be addressed, such as how would cost be controlled, and a delivery system that successfully navigated that minefield would be cumbersome, inefficient, and bureaucratically top-heavy. The only real solution is to completely decriminalize it and tax and regulate it like alcohol. One interesting way to view our current drug policy is this. The American government is like an over-controlling parent, and the American populace is like a rebellious toddler. You can't have these cookies, so I'm going to put them on a high shelf where you can't reach them. So the toddler climbs up on the counter, steals the cookies, and eats them in a closet. Making the cookies taboo just makes them more enticing. A policy of total forbiddance drives the behavior underground, where it becomes clandestine, unsupervised, and infused with guilt. The hiding and shame that result from the illegality then lace the behavior with an adrenaline charge, making the experience more salient and potentially reinforcing, creating an addicting quality. The enhanced shame and fear at being discovered or prosecuted also may require more self-soothing actions, fueling repeated drug-taking behaviors. Our drug policy is making us act like addicts. Guilt exacerbates our national problematic drug use. Perhaps if we were to honor the practice, to normalize it and destigmatize it, we, like the Dutch, would find that we have less of a national drug problem. There are collateral consequences of cannabis. A conviction for a cannabis offense results in two different categories of punishment. The punishment directly imposed by the judge and a range of collateral sanctions that are triggered by the conviction. Collateral sanctions triggered by a cannabis conviction can include revocation or suspension of professional licenses, barriers to employment or promotion, loss of educational aid, driver's license suspension, and bars on adoption, voting, and jury service. For people who depend on public assistance, a cannabis conviction can trigger a bar on receiving food stamps and restrict access to public housing. In some states, these sanctions continue for life. In 38 states, a misdemeanor cannabis conviction, for example, personal possession, can result in a bar on adopting a child. In 7 of these states, this bar can operate for life. In 12 states, a felony cannabis conviction, for example, growing a plant, results in a lifetime bar on receiving food stamps or temporary assistance for needy families. In 7 states, a misdemeanor conviction can result in a lifetime ban. Only felony drug offenses result in this ban, not robbery, not kidnapping, not even murder. In 20 states, occupational licensing and certification agencies may deny, revoke, or suspend a professional license based on a misdemeanor conviction, even if the offense is completely unrelated to the person's duties. In 28 states, a student who's convicted of possessing any amount of cannabis will be denied federal financial aid for a year and may also be denied state educational aid for a year or longer. Further, under the laws of many states, employers may lawfully refuse to hire or promote a person because of a cannabis conviction, or in some states, merely because of an arrest. States should consider enacting provisions that automatically expunge and or seal some or all cannabis-related convictions after successful conviction of the sentence or probation. So, there we go. Other effects beyond direct costs of prohibition enforcement. Increased crime and corruption. Because participants in illegal markets cannot resolve disputes with nonviolent mechanisms like courts and lawyers, they use guns instead. Because participants in the black market must either evade law enforcement or pay them to look the other way, prohibition encourages corruption. Harm to cannabis users. By raising prices and creating the threat of arrest and other legal sanctions, prohibition reduces the welfare of those who use cannabis illegally. Reduced product quality. In a legal market, consumers can sue based on product quality by generating bad publicity or complaining to watchdog groups. In a black market, these methods are unavailable or less effective. Enriching criminals. In a legal market, the income generated is taxed, and that goes to the government. In a black market, suppliers capture those revenues as profits, thus enriching the segment of society most willing to evade the law. Restrictions on medicinal uses of cannabis. Because of prohibition, it's even more tightly controlled than morphine and can't be used for medicinal uses despite abundant evidence that it alleviates multiple ailments. Compromised civil liberties. Because cannabis crimes involve voluntary exchange, meaning no one's hurt, both parties are willing, law enforcement relies on asset seizures, aggressive search tactics, and racial profiling. All these tactics strain accepted notions of civil liberties and generate racial tension. And disrespect for the law. Prohibition fails to deter a great many persons from supplying and consuming cannabis, signaling users and non-users alike that laws are for suckers, therefore undermining the spirit of voluntary compliance that is essential to law enforcement in a free society. And then I just wanted to finish up by having a map showing where we are today. So, we started off with completely white, no public marijuana access program, and now we're moving towards that dark green, and I would love to see that really dark green in our lifetime, just covering the whole nation. One change from this is that Illinois recently went recreational, so Illinois should actually be that dark green color. But yeah, that's all, folks. So I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't go too fast. Yeah, if you have any questions, I didn't get a chance to look at the chat, so I'm going to hop over here now and check that out. I'm trying to figure it out. Sorry, guys. I don't know where my chat is. Sherry, do you want to unmute and tell me where my chat went?
Go ahead and stop your screen sharing, and then it'll be easier to see it.
Let's see. I did pause share. There we are. Chat. No, it didn't work. Oh, my goodness. I'm sorry, guys.
You're still on your share screen now.
Oh, yeah? Well, I mean, I got nothing to hide, so you can just see my pretty background.
No, I know that.
All right. Yay. The damn Rockefellers. I know, right? I'm so glad you guys enjoyed it.
You see it, the chat at the on my screen, it's at the bottom, but I think it's different for users.
That is so cool. Your dad and Louis Armstrong were good friends, Deanne. That's amazing. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? It's so quiet. I don't know if I did that.
Anybody can unmute. Just unmute. Mute, mute. There we go.
Yay! All right. Well, I guess if you guys, I don't have anything else. I took the whole hour. Oh. Okay.
Amanda, this was phenomenal.
Yay!
I think typically, like, when I'm listening to stuff, I like zone out, but the entire time you were talking, I'm like, so like, I'm like intrigued. I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to learn more.
Yay!
You did an excellent job putting it together, and I think it was like very knowledgeable to know the history behind cannabis and like the like from all aspects and the reasons why it's been illegal, and the politics behind it, because it gives us all more motivation to stand up for what like helps us and heals us as human beings. So you taking the time out of your life to really like dive into this and like put this together for everyone is really amazing. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Allison. It means a lot. Yeah, I worked really hard on it. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just in my head, but my head is insane and bouncing around. So I had to really put it together, and I did have some really great sources. I have a couple books I used. I'm happy to share those books in the team group and in the partners group. They're amazing reads. I think everyone should have them. One was actually, it was like a graphic novel where it's a bunch of cartoons. And so it's really easy to read. It's not like big blocks of wording, which can kind of, and I was really worried about that, about kind of zoning on. I know it was a lot of dates and a lot of wah, 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 and I didn't want to sound like Charlie Brown's parents. So I'm glad it didn't come across that way.
You know what I liked about it? There was stuff I didn't even know. Like, I did not, growing up, I smoked it. I'm not gonna lie, but the history of where all that, like, I never had an interest in that at all then, So it amazes me how different I am now, and I actually, what was so funny, because I was talking to Amber, and I always bring Amber into my stuff. I was like, what do your friends think about me selling CBD? They said they think you are the coolest mom of all the moms. And I was like, okay, they do know you don't get high on this, right? And they said, no, they just think it's really cool that you're so open to so much of it. But I was like, it was just interesting to hear that it wasn't like that when I grew up.
Oh yeah, my experience as well was just taking dare. I knew weed was bad. That's all I knew. And a funny story, we've got a minute left. I'm sure a lot of people get laughs out of this. When I want to say maybe 10, I was looking for some cookies because my mama would always hide snacks, right? So I went in her bedroom and then in her bathroom searching for her hidden snacks. And I found this tin, like an Oreo tin, like the old school antique tin under her sink. And I'm like, oh, Oreos, yo, she's keeping them, or, she was keeping them from me. And I opened it up and inside it was her little smoker box. And there was a bowl and some weed and a lighter. And I was like, oh, no, this is so bad. And I grabbed the weed and I went out in the living room, and my mom actually was having a party at the time. That's why I was allowed to sneak away and look for treats. And so there were maybe 10, 15 people in the living room at the time. And I come out and I set it on the table and I said, I know what this is. This is marijuana and this is bad. And everyone just starts laughing so hard. And my mom is trying to stay very, with it, because drugs are bad and you don't want to tell your kid, that they're not, but it's just weed, so I'm glad. I always, later, my mom and I had the pleasure of smoking with my mom before she passed. And it was something that I would never change for this world, because I think every parent and child, once the child is old enough to know and understand, should sit and have a conversation after smoking a joint together. And I know that may sound crazy to some, but I mean, you sit down and have a beer together and have a conversation. So why can't you sit down and have a joint? I feel like the conversation my mom and I had that night was the best one we ever had, and I'll treasure it forever. And I smoke with my dad still. So, you know what I mean? I think it's great that these days more people are getting educated. Their children are getting educated. I have friends whose kids know, they see them smoking, they don't think anything of it, and they will grow up to be more, woke than we were. And so that's all I want, is that hopefully I taught you people something that you can go on and maybe change one person's mind. Like, you guys know it's not bad for you. It's only illegal because really rich people wanted to keep getting richer, and really racist people wanted to keep people of color down. That's literally the only reason.
So I want to something really fast if I can. I'm sorry, Sherry.
Oh, I was just going to ask really quick, because I am very interested in this. I know marijuana and industrial hemp, they're cousins, are part of the, cannabis family. But where I like to know where that comes into play. You know what I mean? Like, I've read the books and all that stuff, and I've got that information here. But, I like to know, I guess that would be another whole training. But I mean, I know that's not something we can do now, but
it's literally just breeding.
I would want to do. Definitely.
So it's literally just at 0.3% is where it turns from hemp to cannabis, is really the best way to explain it to other people. Is a test is what determines it these days. It used to be that hemp was this long, gangly, ugly plant because it was more fibrous. And then you had, the other style that was shorter and bushier, used for consumption. But now the hemp is grown so much better that it doesn't look like the gangly hemp of the olden days. And when it's that is actually one of the things that police officers struggle with today, is they can't look at a plant and tell if it's illegal or not. And they don't like that. They have to put it into a test and determine, is it 0.3% THC or not. There's a store in my local town that was just raided, a tobacco store, and they had hemp CBD flower, and they were raided, and the guy was put in jail. He had to sell his store. And it's all because the test that they have on site doesn't tell the difference. And that's all it is. It's basically the same plant, just a different amount of THC.
Cool.
I just wanted to thank you, Amanda, for this.
You're welcome.
This kind of information is very powerful, especially with like the history in the beginning of all that when it was actually classified as medicine. And I think that it sucks that it just sucks that all of this is like this because of money and people being in people's pockets, and it's just gross. And I feel like it's really cool that we are in a position to help change people's minds, and information like this is what we need to get out to the public that still buys into the DARE and the reefer madness philosophy, even though it seems so insane to us. I went through DARE and I didn't realize, like, my dad passed away when I was 12, and he was very sick. He had kidney failure and he was at the end stage of it, and he was extremely ill. And he was way older than my mom. When they met, she was 18 and he was 40. So he was in the big band era, and he got famous for playing drums when he was 15 because he had ADD, and they didn't even know what it was. So my grandparents he was like tapping on everything with spoons and knives and forks and everything, and it was driving him nuts. So they put all their money together, got him a set of drums, and he self-taught himself how to play jazz drums. And he started touring with the big bands by the time he was 15. So he was knee deep in that entire culture. And he knew, was friends with Louis Armstrong, and knew all of the people that you mentioned, like Lionel Hampton and Ella Fitzgerald and all of these amazing artists. And so that was part of his culture. So he brought that with him back to Sacramento when he got sick, and he was teaching drums, but he would always smoke. And I didn't know, growing up with him, what was really going on. I just knew my dad was crazy sick and he was on dialysis, and he always had these things rolled by his bedside that he had to have all the time. And he would light one up the second that he woke up, and it made him better, and it made him be able to eat food. And he coughed a lot, but that it was his medicine. He called them his cigarette medicine cigarettes or something. And so it wasn't until I was in middle school, and I had my friend and I found her dad's stuff, and we smoked it, and I remember the smell being like, oh, I remember that smell. And then I asked my mom about it, and she said, do you never realize that those medicine cigarettes that your dad always had was marijuana? And I was like, shut up. And then it all made sense to me. Like, it wasn't, I connected that. I luckily was able to connect that he used that for medicine and that it helped him greatly. And I remember watching him change as a little kid. I remember him watching him like throw up and be so sick, and he would light his medicine cigarette, and then he could eat, and then he could function, and then he could do drum lessons and things like that. So when she told me that, it flipped that switch in my head from that DARE mentality, and that I had to sneak around, and that it was a terrible, awful thing, to remembering how much like it saved my dad's life. And when you said that you got a chance to smoke with your mom before she passed away, it just made me choke up, because like I would have given anything to like be able to give my dad like this CBD that we have when he was suffering so greatly, and to be able to, like, I would sneak it into the nursing home if he was still here with us. And anyway, it was really powerful for me, and I'm really grateful for this. And I truly believe that cannabis is medicine, because it literally has saved my life. So, and you too. So I'm just, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I see people, it saves people's lives every single day that I get to see. Some of you know what I do and some of you don't, and that's okay. I work in DC, and so basically I provide cannabis to people struggling, and so I have that chance to see people go from literally, not able to eat like your dad, and then just all of a sudden they can eat. And I get to hear those wonderful stories every day. And so because I was a product of seeing that same commercial where, this is your brain, and they show an egg, and then this is your brain on drugs, and I'm sure you're all nodding heads, so you all remember. And like I was like, oh well, that's bad, and it took me until my senior year of high school. I was not going to ever touch it ever. I didn't smoke cigarettes, I didn't drink alcohol, nothing. And I was all about going to college. And then I got accepted to college, and my best friend was like, hey, and ever since, and the very first time I smoked by myself, I did my best Latin translation ever. Every single tense was perfect. It was 100%. I knew then. I was like, oh, there's something here, but it did. It took me until senior year of high school to change my mind. I believed it all the way up until then.
That's amazing. Wow. It's so funny when you're saying the egg on the frying pan and all that. I was so anti-drug everything. I didn't like alcohol. I didn't do any of that. Did I try it? Yes. It wasn't until my senior year in high school when I drank my first beer and smoked my first joint. And matter of fact, that first joint was like, it didn't do anything. Like,
so a lot of people actually have that experience. You are not the only one. There's a lot of people that have that experience where it's not until the second time that they realize what was even happening. That's very typical. Very typical. So if I were to do another call on cannabis, what types of topics, like today was the legality. I mean, what do people want? What do you guys want to know? I mean, my head is full of information. I teach people every day.
I think, go ahead, Deanne.
Okay, so this is something that I don't know if this is possible for you, but I would be willing to collaborate on it too. My experience, one of the most, okay, so when I went down a rabbit hole, I fell into drug addiction, I got clean. When I got clean, cannabis was the last thing that I was going to do because I was terrified. Because in the 12-step meetings, everyone, you can't, oh, so I smoked a joint and then all of a sudden I had a needle in my arm in 2 weeks and was, like, it was just like, I was terrified. So having the background that I had on it and knowing so much as I knew about it, I went through recovery miserable. I believe that I was suffering from post-acute withdrawal syndrome, even into 2 years after recovery, because I just couldn't get out of bed. My symptoms were unmanageable. I was unwilling to go in and get prescription medications prescribed to me. I was scared to go down that rabbit hole. I was definitely not going to go anywhere near cannabis. And I was going to be shunned by the recovery community if I did. And that sucks. And like, I'm so glad that I wasn't one of the people that I knew that went back out because of that miserable feeling in recovery before I decided to go with the cannabis and try it again, knowing that like I wasn't doing it to get high. I was doing it to alleviate these symptoms that I was suffering from so greatly. And a light switch flipped on. I went to school. I got a degree. Never once did I go back to using, but never once did I step into an NA meeting again. And I lost that whole recovery community because I chose to use cannabis. And I swear to God, I'm sitting here at 10 years and I'm still clean. I've never picked up a hard drug again. But that, like, I really feel like we need to do like something in the like world to like put it out there that like it really isn't a gateway drug. It really isn't like, it shouldn't be classified with like heroin and cocaine and meth and all these things. It can alleviate the symptoms of withdrawals of those things. And so many people are going out because they're miserable from those symptoms of withdrawals, even when they last 1, 2, and 3 years, these long post-acute withdrawal symptom things. And cannabis is not a viable option for them. And it sucks. And it should be. It should be, because it could save their lives.
1,000%.
Subject, going on that subject, because I'm not a recovering addict, and I'm sorry that I interrupted, but I'm not a recovering addict, so I don't know what that's like. But that is a very sensitive subject, saying it is okay for an addict to use marijuana, that they won't go back into hard drugs, because that has happened. And we have to be very careful because of what we promote with Illuminati.
But CBD.
Right. CBD, absolutely.
Not I don't want to do that.
Okay. Okay. We need to be really careful on that.
Yeah, that's a touchy subject. Because Deanne, you had some great points, and it would be amazing if, like, I don't know if you're still recording this.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I can stop.
But that